Hey guys, welcome to Wednesday Wrap Up. I guess that's what we're calling it. We could change the name, it doesn't really matter. But I am so excited to have Z-Man back, and I got so much good response from you guys throughout the week that you really love the show. And I do too. I think it's a lot of fun. And Z-Man and I talked off the camera. We thought, hey, we'll do kind of a deep dive into Nixon and kind of compare it to Trump and the administrations. And I said, yeah, that'd be something different instead of just doing a recap of the news. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And again, I appreciate all your support. We are already got some power chats before the show. And Z-Man and I, we will split them 50% each at the end of the month. So if you like this type of programming, show us some love, submit some questions on YouTube. We're on YouTube. They have super chats. Rumble has rants and power chats right here that you can send a question. And how we're going to do the format so we don't ruin the flow, just send them throughout the show and then we're going to answer them at the end of the show, like the last 15 minutes. And due to time constraints, we'll try to keep this to an hour. So that just gives you an idea of when to send your questions in. But Z-Man, I love your Nixon iconic.
Yeah, there he is, old Dick Nixon. I was going to use the picture. There was a poster that says "The nation needs Dick." That was you think about it, 1970s, 50 years ago, and there were so much more. I mean, obviously they knew what they were saying, and they were just being very cheeky with it. I mean, even back in the 50s. I found an Eisenhower poster, and it was Ike and Dick, and it was kind of like Dick and Jane sort of poster.
Yeah.
It's like, it's funny how, so much more mature people were back 50, 60, 70 years ago than they are today. It really is a different age.
Yeah, it really is. And we were talking before the show, and we have a lot of younger people. I mean, I'm old, so I am so old. When I went to elementary school, Nixon was president. The president's up, and he was the president.
Yeah.
And that was in 1969. I went to first grade. So it's been a while. But yeah, he was just a real quick recap for the audience in case some people may not remember all the details. And I'm not going to do a whole wiki thing on him, but he was the 37th president of the United States from 1969 to 1974. And obviously the Watergate scandal, he was the first president to resign. But people forget, he was also the vice president under Eisenhower during the 50s. He was before that, he was a popular senator from California. He was involved, he was involved with that. It's showing that he was a communist. He was a very anti-communist. And then he decided to run for presidency in 1960 first. And he lost. I put the lost in quotes. And then he kind of had his years in the wilderness, he called it, and he came back and ran for president. And as I was talking to Z-Man, I lived through this era, and I said this the last show, but some of you guys may not have been here. When I was young, they had something called the Book of Lists, and as a kid, I loved it because it'd be like, what are the tallest mountains in the world? And I love those type of things. Or, and they had sports lists. Who had the most running yards of an NFL running back, the top 10. But they also had political lists. And one of the political lists was, who are the most evil people in history of the world? And Richard Nixon, at the time, this was like 1974 or 5, was number one. He was above Mustache Man. And people don't realize how much hatred people had for Nixon, especially the left and the hippies. If you watch old sitcoms like All in the Family, you see it. Oh, God, they just hated him with a passion. And because he's an imperial president, fascist, real right wing. But Z-Man, when I review his history, he wasn't really all that right wing in many aspects of it. I mean, he normalized relations with Russia or the Soviet Union at the time. He went to China. And it does remind me a lot of Trump. Their personalities were very different, but just they were sort of interesting characters, unlike the cookie cutters that we see so often.
Yeah, it's funny it's a really wild in a way, the sort of parallels, some of the parallels between Nixon and Trump. But Nixon, they called him, he was this mean guy. He was he was going to be Hitler, an authoritarian. He was dumb. He was anti-intellectual and all this stuff. Yet Nixon, as a man, was one of the more decent and moral people we've had as president. I mean, he was a Quaker.
Yeah.
He prayed on his knees. When he was a young man, he worked in the family business. His father got sick. He had an opportunity to go to Harvard on a scholarship, but instead went to a local college so he could help take care of the family. I mean, this is a decent guy, served in the military. I mean, it was a really fundamentally decent man. And when he decided to run in 68, he had to have a long conversation with his wife because she was ashamed that, they didn't have a lot of money, and she didn't want all that public exposure, and she didn't like being famous or any of that stuff. I mean, these were genuinely humble people in a lot of ways. And he was not the guy, he was not the monster they accused him of. And that's true of Trump. Every once in a while, Trump, you'll see Trump with like little kids, and you can see there's a guy who loved having children. He loved his own kids. He likes little kids. He's a great old guy now. Sometimes guys, the old guys are great with kids for whatever reason. They're just kids love them. And that's when you kind of get this glimpse. You're like, wait a second, this is not an evil man. This is a incredibly generous man. And that was certainly true of Nixon. But it's funny in a way, though, is that Nixon was too nice. Trump's a tough guy. Nixon couldn't have gone through what Trump has gone through, and I think Watergate is the proof of it. Trump would never have resigned. He never would have done that. He's just not that kind of guy. Nixon thought he was doing it for the good of the country, and in a lot of ways he trusted the system too much. The reason that Watergate worked on him was because he was a guy who fundamentally trusted the goodness of the American people and the logic of the American political system. And he just didn't see what was coming. He didn't see how he was being set up by the blob, by the FBI, by the CIA, by the media, by all these people, permanent Washington. And, Trump, to his credit, clearly, I mean, maybe he fell for it the first time, but, he quickly learned his lesson. So in that regard, they're a little bit different. Trump is a little tougher. A little tougher guy. I say that. I mean, Nixon served in the Second World War. I mean, he was a physically courageous man, but that there's that meanness there. There's always, I played sports my whole life, and there's always got to be that meanness, that kind of gets you that little extra inch to win. And Trump has that, and Nixon, I don't think really had that. He was a tough guy, and he took a lot of stuff. He took a lot of crap, but he didn't have that little extra bit of meanness because he was a fundamentally decent guy. I mean, it's funny. I look back now and think, man, wouldn't it be nice if we had more people like Nixon in our politics?
Yeah, it is amazing to think that. And you're talking about Trump being basically a nice guy. And to determine this, I'd like to hear various data points. And Elon Musk said, and I think I know he's biased, but he said, I've met I'm hanging around Donald Trump all the time, but I've never seen him say anything hateful or act that way. And my wife, Sasha, has a cousin that met Trump years ago before he was president in a men's washroom. And they introduced each other. And like a couple of years later, Trump remembered the guy, remembered his name. And this guy's just a regular guy. Trump really has that ability, remembers people's names. He's very personable. And so I think they kind of shared that quality. And it was interesting you brought up that Nixon lacked the toughness or the edge. And I think you're right. He was a very civil man. And that was shown in the 1960 election, which I will just come out and say because I know firsthand, well, secondhand from my father. My father at the time lived in Chicago, Illinois. He was briefly involved with Republican politics. He was a poll watcher in Cook County in 1960. And he got so disillusioned after 1960, he just totally dropped out of politics for the rest of his life. Because he told me, and I trust my father, that was 100% stolen. Daley did. He was a big machine mayor of Chicago, and they had cemeteries, people dead voting for Kennedy. And it was sort of known back then, and they had a chance to have a recount or to challenge it. And even Eisenhower thought maybe they should. But Nixon said, no, I don't want to do that. That'll just put the country through too much turmoil. I will just step away. So that's sort of the how Nixon was, even though he has this reputation right after Watergate of being a paranoid, evil man that does dirty tricks, all that type of thing.
Well, and it's interesting. I remember on the 2020 election, I remember, I don't know, it was like 8 o'clock or something. And I remember one of my, person I know is an older baby boomer, in his 70s.
Mm-hmm.
He texted me and he says, oh, geez, unless they do a Dick Nixon on him, he's going to pull it off. And sure enough, it was the same thing, because that's what Cook County did.
Yeah.
People forget how this worked. Cook County basically waited until all the votes were counted, and then
Yes.
he manufactured enough to win.
Yeah.
That's what happened in Pennsylvania and Michigan. The same trick. And I remember thinking, holy smokes, you talk about a weird sort of parallel. But, of course, the difference there is that Nixon, hey, for the good of the country, I'm not going to challenge the system. And Trump said, screw that. I'm going to war. And that was he's just a different guy. And look, politics ain't beanbag. And, I remember when Pat Buchanan ran for president, I think it was Sam Francis who said, I love him, but he's too nice for politics. And it's funny how these nice guys always get painted as being bad people. And Nixon is certainly that kind of guy. He was a guy who really loved America. I mean, this guy was one of those people, a really civic nationalist guy. And I think that was, it was how they got him with Watergate. Because, people forget that when that all broke loose, the Nixon people didn't order this. They had no idea what the hell was going on. There's a famous exchange, it shows up in the books a lot about the time, between him and a guy named B.B. Rebozo, was one of his assistants. And Nixon liked to go on vacation to Miami Beach. And apparently the story hit the news, and Nixon looked at B.B. Rebozo and goes, this can't possibly be our people. No one's that stupid. And B.B. Rebozo goes, yeah, it's impossible. No one on our team is this dumb. They had no idea that the Watergate break-in or any of this stuff. And, all along the way, Nixon kind of trusted the system that, look, I didn't do anything wrong. But they just kept setting him up, and they teed it up so that he looked like a villain and they could chase him out of town. And it's that trust that they use. It's one of the early examples of how the bad guys turn our virtues into vices. You should trust the system. I mean, in an honorable system, you should trust it, want to support the rules and not challenge them and all that stuff. But the bad guys don't think that way. And I think Trump, what makes him different and in a lot of ways makes him sort of, a good bookend to Nixon in a way, is that he has no illusions about these people. He trusts the system, but he understands that people in it are evil, and you have to play tough with them. And we're seeing it now. I mean, he's playing hardball, very serious hardball with them.
Yeah, and it's a good illustration that if the left hates you like they did Nixon, being a nice guy and trying to be friendly is not going to make them like you anymore. In fact, that they just perceive that as weakness. And I would say we saw a little bit of this with Trump in 2016, 17. He became, I think he really tried to work with the Democrats. He wanted to be their friend. Because Trump, I've always seen, this is going to probably shock some people, but back in 2016, I didn't see him politically that much different than Bill Clinton, really, in the 90s.
Yeah, I agree completely, And
everyone's like, oh, this extreme right winger. I'm like, really? This guy from New York City? I never really saw his positions that radical, and he's always been this deal guy, want to work with people. And Trump has that way, unless it's personal, and I think Zelensky may have made it personal recently. But in general, you remember how he used to make fun of Rubio, little Rubio, and he always gives people nicknames. But, if you bend the knee, everything's forgiven, and he's best pals with you. So he's got that way about him. And I think he wanted to work with Washington that way, but they did everything to try to undermine him. And I think this time he's come back with a vengeance, because he knows playing the nice guy is not going to win you any points at all. And so I think that is an important point. And getting Watergate, it's funny because we're talking about this, but I'm thinking of, this is embarrassing because it's just like, I've always been young my life and all of a sudden I'm old. It's like, how the hell that happened?
But I know the feeling. I was thinking about that this afternoon.
And it was like, okay, so when I was a kid, Watergate, everyone knew Watergate, but a lot of people that watch this, even especially younger people, they have some vague recollection about it in the history books. I felt really old the other day. I met this kid, it was like a young adult. They weren't born during 9/11. I'm like, good God, I feel old now. So that's ancient history to them, like Pearl Harbor to me. But Watergate, and correct me if I'm wrong, basically by today's standards, it was like really nothing. Is my understanding some of the people involved with Nixon's team, they broke into the Watergate complex trying to bug the DNC, doing some dirty tricks to get the strategy from the Democrats. Not that it really mattered, because Nixon won in a landslide in 1972. He beat George McGovern, and he just killed him. And Nixon was, people forget that Nixon was actually quite popular back then. And so there was all these tactics that were done. And then it wasn't that Nixon ordered it, but there was this idea that he wasn't investigating it or he was covering it up. And he came under a lot of pressure, and he did his favorite, his famous, "I am not a crook." And the press turned on him. And I think you've talked about this on your column. By the way, if you guys haven't, read the real, what's your blog name exactly? I have a bookmark. Is the ZMAN blog?
Yeah, thezman.com.
THEZMAN. Read it every day. It's great. But this is where the press really became like their heroes. They were investigating this, and I think it was the Washington Post, if I remember right. It was two reporters, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, I think, and they made their whole career about being the heroic reporters standing up to corruption. And to this day, I think our media class they all think they're going to be the next Carl Bernstein or Bob Woodward. And so it really kind of changed the dynamic of how the media became a powerful force, what you would call the blob that we see even today, although it could be breaking apart now.
Yeah, the funny thing about Watergate, there's a great book. If people want to actually, as an entry point, now, let me just back up a second. I will credit Richard Nixon to a degree for me having an interest in politics, because when Watergate broke, I was 8 years old, so I knew nothing about politics. My family was not political at all. They didn't ever talk politics. They didn't watch the national news. They watched the local news. My father would read the local newspaper. They were normal people. I didn't know anybody who was interested in politics. But then all of a sudden they started paying attention, and they were worried. All of a sudden, what's going on with the country? Things seem to be going the wrong direction. And they just went through the 60s. The Cultural Revolution was doing horrible things in the working class. All of a sudden, poor people are getting divorces, and it's awful, right? So, it was a very worrisome time, particularly for people in my class, lower class people. But I noticed that my parents cared about this. They cared about Watergate, and there was a period when, like, after it was over and Jimmy Carter was president, I remember my father. I could have swore, it was the first time I ever heard my father curse, because every time Carter would show on TV, he would mutter an expletive, and my mother would say, "John," and because he would bolt out of the couch to change the channel, because we didn't have a remote control back then. But it was that got me curious about it all, and as I got older, I started reading about it, and really the first book I read was G. Gordon Liddy's Will, and it's a great book to read. It's a great autobiography. It's a good, fun read. But he had a similar experience that I had. I was terrified of lightning as a child. And how I broke my fear of it was my brother locked me outside in a lightning storm, and I was not going to show my fear. So I just stood there and looked up at the sky as it started to rain, and I wasn't afraid. It was beautiful. And to this day, I still love watching lightning storm. And, it's a great example of how you overcome your fear by overcoming them. Well, G. Gordon Liddy had the exact same experience in that book. And I remember reading and thinking, holy crap, I'm not a lunatic. This guy who was so interesting and wrote a book, and I didn't realize who Liddy was at the time, but it got me hooked on the whole thing, and he had all this interesting inside baseball. And so I wound up reading all these books. And one of the books my last Nixon book I read was a book called Silent Coup. And so it's a long build-up to recommend a book. But if people really want to get a sense of what Watergate was about and why it continues to be important, this guy, Len Kolodny, he just did all this research, and he started figuring some stuff out that, wait a second, Deep Throat wasn't real. It was fake. It wasn't Mark Felt, the guy from the FBI, because the descriptions of all these things, he started piecing. This guy actually went to Washington and looked at pictures and scenes and all these different ways in which it was described when they met Deep Throat. They said it was physically impossible. The descriptions of the events couldn't have happened because the buildings were in different places, and there's no way you could see, putting a flower pot in one spot to signal that there's secret information afloat or that kind of stuff. And he got sued by a bunch of John Dean sued him twice and lost both times. And what it really describes is that the FBI, the CIA, the sort of permanent Washington decided to come together and get rid of Nixon. They all agreed that they didn't like Nixon, and so they used their friends in the media. I mean, Woodward was Army intelligence, and he had connections to the CIA. And of course, the Washington Post has always been a company town paper, and it was really a coup. He called the book "Silent Coup," and it's a great read. It's written kind of like a novel, but it's well researched. It's withstood, I think, 3 lawsuits total. And so it's a good, interesting introduction to Watergate. But it really kind of shows, as I've argued, that the managerial class took over our politics. They threw Nixon out, and this permanent Washington, the blob, was going to run things, and they have been. And now we see that Trump is, he's the white knight showing up to kill the blob.
Why were they so upset about Nixon? I was looking at his policies, and it was interesting. And I would argue that the 60s didn't really end in 1969. I would say they ended about 74. I mean, culturally.
Yeah, probably right.
And because you still had this stuff going on. But Nixon, he got us out of Vietnam War. He ended the draft. He went to China. He tried what they called détente. Domestically, he was involved with the 26th Amendment to lower the voting age from 21 to 18. I think it should be raised to 35 or something. But and he enforced the desegregation of Southern schools. And he even put in wage and price controls briefly for 90 days. That was a disaster. But he wasn't like this real right-wing figure. So what do you think they really objected to Nixon about? What was it that upset him about the man?
Well, it's funny. I'm glad you brought that up, because I was thinking about that when I was kind of getting ready for this, and thinking, in a way, it was really a class distinction. He was a working class guy. I always forget that about Nixon. He really was a working class guy. He didn't go to Harvard. He went to Whittier College, and then he went to Duke Law School. And I think, he was an anti-communist, a strong anti-communist.
Oh, big time, yes.
Mm-hmm. And, I think that was a big part of it. And, Nixon had a distrust. I think, the weird thing about communism, I think, was because it was such a upper middle class sort of fad, that I think that made him suspicious of these people. And they could sense it. They're like, wait a second, this poor guy from California, he should be showing us proper respect, but he doesn't. And Nixon, he clashed with a lot of the experts, especially over Vietnam. I think that may have been a big part of it too. Or China, his decision was pretty much unilateral to go to China,
right?
And and he was also, he wasn't like a huge fan of Israel either, and that may have been a problem. There's a great story about how he pulled Kissinger out of the Middle East because he said he just was irrational. He was such a Zionist, he couldn't be trusted. And then eventually, this was from Kissinger, and Kissinger eventually said, he was right. I was out of my mind when it came to Zionism, and it was the best thing that he ever did, was pull me out of that and put somebody else in charge of Israel policy. But you can't imagine that the Israelis like that very much.
Yeah, it's weird because he almost had like a couple of different views about that matter, and I don't really quite understand it, because he did support Israel in the Yom Kippur War. He did gave an airlift to give them supplies, so that did happen. But there was that famous tape, I don't know if you ever heard of it, where he was talking to Billy Graham about a certain group.
Yeah.
And so he was a little bit aware of some things, let's put it that way. So I think and then there you had Kissinger. So it was it was a different time, just put it that way. And people were a little bit, I don't know, they would say stuff that they wouldn't say today, but
he had old fashioned views about those subjects, And,
yeah, he kind of reminded me, honestly, of my grandfather. Was kind of that way. Not like real, conspiracy minded, but and my grandfather was one of those old types of people. Like when he would meet you, Z-Man, and based on your last name, he would immediately say, "Oh, what's that ethnicity?" That was what they did back there. They wouldn't want to know where you're from, and so he was.
Yeah, and I remember my grandparents were always like that. All the old people, when they introduced some person in some story they were telling you, they told you their ethnicity because it was important to them.
Yeah, my grandfather said, "Well, what kind of name is that? Is that Polish or what is it?" You know, it was like a big thing there, and yeah, but he understood about certain things too back then. So I think Nixon. It was interesting. You could be a part. He always thought that that whole Hiss affair, he pissed off a lot of powerful people because it turned out he was right. Hiss was a communist.
Yeah, and you can't escape the fact that our greatest ally was wildly overrepresented in the communist espionage rings.
Oh, big time.
This is
Yeah.
yeah, this is something that David Horowitz, if you read he's got a great book. It's like his autobiography where he talks about being a red diaper baby, right?
Yes, there
And
were a lot of them.
his,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, and his family were all communists, and he makes it clear. It's like, look, this was a very Talmudic of movement, and he later kind of came to terms with this, and then his life went on a different direction. But I think it's probably Nixon had very conventional views, but the convention had changed. A lot of the stuff that he got accused of doing in politics, well, Johnson did it, Kennedy ddid it. I mean, politics wasn't beanbag. If you had a little power, you used it to scuff up your enemies a little bit. And I think the rules changed. That's what they did. They changed the rules and said, hey, you're in violation of rules. And getting back to Trump, they really did the same thing in 2016. I mean, they went after General Flynn for something that everybody does. They ruined that man's life. I think they even made him crazy, I think. Obviously the way that they treated Trump, wiretapping Trump Tower and trying to access the servers there and all this stuff.
Which, by the way, did you see that's under FBI investigation? They're investigating Comey for that. That's wonderful.
I know. You know what? If I had to pick somebody to go to prison just for symbolism reason, that smarmy prick would definitely.
Oh, you remember when he was this all came out about his corruption, and he had someone. There obviously someone was there. He was like in the woods, just thinking about God or nature, and it was real artistic. I'm like, oh my God, it was so staged. He was like, I'm just a man standing up for America, and all these arrows are coming after me, and I'm like, oh come on, you're part of the deep state. Yeah, that guy is obnoxious.
If I had to pick between him and Hillary Clinton, I'm gonna want to see Comey go to jail because at least with Hillary Clinton, she doesn't shy away from the fact that she's a shrew and she enjoys being evil. I mean, this is a person I think enjoys it, She
is. And like I said with Trump, we also, because I'm in Arkansas, people that have known the Clintons, no one's ever said anything good about Hillary. She's a bitch, and people do not like her. And I've heard that from Secret Service. She's just a real nasty person. Someone that really is a likable guy. I'm not saying I agree with all his politics, but he would have a beer with us and joking around is Bill Clinton. He was a good old boy. He could get along with people, but
yeah, I've been convinced my whole life. When I laid eyes on Bill Clinton, we're getting kind of a little stray here, but when I laid eyes on Bill Clinton back when he was running in the primary, I remember saying to one of my friends, I said, it's probably true he got into politics because it would make it easier for him to score with women. And my friend started laughing because I was thinking exactly the same thing. I mean, I think every guy kind of figured that it was Clinton's real life. His real love in life was women. That's what he cared about.
It was even, and we'll get back. I have a thread. I'm tying this back to Nixon and Trump. But my wife, Sasha, she knows someone, I won't say who it is, in Arkansas. Clinton actually he met her in a bar and sent the state police to her house asking her if she wanted to go see the governor. So, I mean, this was known in Arkansas. That guy was even back in the day. But the point is were the personalities is part of the problem with Nixon. And he was a good guy, but he didn't have that. I don't know if I want to use the term charm like Trump has, but Trump really, there's almost like a cultish following with him. I'm not that guy. I like Trump, but there's some people just really the God Emperor, the whole thing. And I don't think Nixon so much had that. There was this idea that Nixon was more inward and he just wasn't able to navigate that. So do you think that is part of the difference between the two and why Trump is able to fight back more? Not just the niceness factor, but the personality factor.
Yeah, I think Nixon was very class aware. One of the weird stories I remember reading about Nixon is because he had that kind of odd way in which he talked. And it was almost, it
Hmm.
was so flat. There was never any, he had this great baritone voice, and he sounded good, but it was just always kind of flat and almost
Yeah.
overly controlled. And apparently, when he was a young person, his parents said, look, you don't want to get too much attention by, overstating things or getting excited in your language. You want to be really calm and all that because, we're working class people. You don't want to be the nail that stands up. And I think in a lot of ways, Nixon, the one real fault that he had is he never could come to terms with the fact that he was just one of the dirt people. And
Hmm.
he could be a smart dirt people. You can be an accomplished dirt people,
Right.
but you're just not going to be a cloud person. That's just the way it is. And I guess, look, I have some personal connection here. I mean, I grew up dirt poor, and I struggle being around upper middle class people because they have all these weird ways in which they do things.
Hmm.
I just confuse the hell out of me. And inevitably I wind up saying something I shouldn't. Oftentimes I say something because I think it'll be funny, and it turns out to be scandalous. And so I recognize that with Nixon. I think that really was kind of a problem that he had. It was a hang up for him. Trump, on the other hand, he likes being a guy from Queens.
Yeah.
His first Ferrari is going up on auction. And somebody still owns it that he bought like in the 80s or something.
Yeah.
And it's like the opening bid's going to be like $3 million, because it was Trump's Ferrari, But that was Trump. He did. I don't think he ever drove it. He just bought it because he was like, I have
cool.
a supermodel wife and a Ferrari.
Yeah.
And because you ever seen pictures of his condo with his son and his when Barron was little, sitting on the stuffed lion?
Oh yeah, yeah, iconic. Yeah, he was so over the top. He was so different than Nixon that way. So, do you think, getting back to the whole Watergate, do you think there were? I think a lot of times people, they keep trying to relive their history. The conservatives is always 1985. The left is always 1938 or 1968. Were they trying to relive Watergate with the whole Russian gate thing? And by the way, that's where we got the stupid gate thing on everything.
Yeah.
Anytime there's a scandal, it's because of Watergate. Now you have to put gate on it. It's been overdone. But they were trying to do the quote Russian gate. And I think they were trying to like relive the early 70s. They're going to be the heroic press. They break all this. They have the hearings. Remember, they have even all these hearings. They're going to have all the cameras on them, and the nation would applaud them, and it all fell apart. But I think they were just trying to relive Nixon. I really think that was part of it with Trump.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I remember watching this, and what was weird is that I remember, I know way too much about Watergate, but there was this great scene in Watergate, right, where Alexander Butterfield, Butterfield or Butterworth, no, Butterworth is the syrup, Butterfield. He comes to testify, and he's the one who discloses that there was a taping system in the White House, and no one knew about this. Well, of course, the truth is, people knew about this and knew he knew. The whole thing was staged. It was all fake.
Mm-hmm.
And if you remember back in the when Alexander Vindman showed up to testify,
yeah,
he was supposed to play that role. The problem is he didn't have anything. He had nothing. There was nothing to work with. And I remember thinking, man, this is like it's like the people who are trying to remake classic films. Like they and Lord of the Rings. They tried. Amazon tried to remake it. And they made all these weird, diverse midgets who are the hobbits and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the same thing. It's like, wait a second, these people are trying to remake the story of 50 years ago, but they're all thumbs. They don't know how to make it work. And so, Trump is. It's funny in a lot of ways. Trump is like Nixon, because Nixon's career, to some degree, counted on having the right enemies. If you go back and you read about 68 when he ran. I mean, Kennedy was in the race for Democrats, and Johnson was obviously the president. And then all of a sudden, Johnson drops out after the Tet Offensive. Kennedy gets shot and killed, and the Democrats are in disarray. And the Republicans, they had planned to just boot the election, just say, well, Johnson will win, and we'll just have to, we'll just be little beautiful losers like we always are. And Nixon kind of wound up with good opponents, and until, of course, obviously Watergate, but. I mean, Trump is a lot like that too. I mean, Vindman is a weird little man. He's the kind of guy.
Yeah.
If you see him around like a schoolyard or a park, you're just going to call the police, even if you don't have kids.
Yeah. Keep your kids away from him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot about that because Johnson decided not to run, and then it was Hubert Humphrey, his vice president, ran. And it's a fairly close election, and then Nixon won in the landslide in '72.
Hey, you want to have some fun? Go back and look at the 1960 electoral map. And there's I kind of stumbled on this earlier today. I'm like, no, you talk about another bookend for Trump. Here you had a Yankee, I mean, the Yankiest of Yankees, winning mostly southern states in 1960, while Nixon, he won all the western states and all that, but they were lightly populated, didn't have as many electoral votes.
Right.
Then Trump comes along, this Yankee from New York sweeps the South. That's a solid South for him. And in a lot of ways, he owes Nixon for this, because Nixon, he developed the concept of flipping the South to the Republican Party, to the Southern strategy. And it's just kind of interesting. If you look at the maps, it's an entirely different country 50 years ago than it is today.
It was, and people don't realize it's pretty well gone now. But when I was a kid in the South, anyway, and I didn't grow up in the South, but the reason of that is there was still a hatred of Lincoln and the Republican Party in the South, and so most of the Southerners, white Southerners, were Democrats. It didn't mean they were woke or voted for men in dresses or anything like that. It meant something different back then. And you're right, Nixon was the first Southern strategy to change that. But for the longest time, if you're in the South, you want to vote Republican. You just want to do that.
And so blacks in the South voted Democrat. I mean, they voted Republican, not Democrat.
Right. It was funny how that's flipped, but that was part of it. The other interesting parallel, and I want you to see how much this is equivalent, is when Nixon came in 1968. A lot of people may not realize, but we were knee deep into Vietnam with, 500,000 troops there or something. It started under Kennedy, then Johnson escalated it. And it was dropped on Nixon's lap. And I think he had the phrase, didn't he, peace with honor or something? He wanted to get out of South Vietnam, but the leadership in South Vietnam was corrupt. Sound familiar, guys?
Yeah.
and so they had all these negotiations, and then Nixon even escalated the bombing of Cambodia to try to end the war, and then eventually we just pulled out. It was just it was a very, very bitter part of American history. It really was. It really scarred our psyche at the time. People today may not realize it, but people were down on the military. They felt that we got defeated. It was just, everyone just wanted to forget that era. But he was actually trying to get us out of there. And obviously the parallel is, we don't have troops there, but Trump has this Ukrainian mess. And is there a danger he could go the same route as Nixon instead of just, in 1968, the best thing Nixon could have done is just pull the hell out of there. Who cares about South Vietnam? But he couldn't, and I'm worried that Trump may try to get sucked in Ukraine with a mineral deal and this type of thing. Do you think that's a potential?
Yeah, it is a great parallel, because, I was laughing during the campaign. I think Trump even said, or somebody may have used a headline, Trump, claims he has a secret plan to end the war in Ukraine. I remember, I don't know where I saw it, but I just remember laughing like, well, that's a Dick Nixon line. When Nixon ran in '68, I got a secret plan to get us out of Vietnam. And the cleverness of it is that you couldn't argue about his plan because it was a secret. So right. You just had to take his word for it. And I think Trump probably remembers that, and it's a great strategy. And I think though, it's probably easier for Trump to probably get out of Ukraine, I think, because we had, I don't know how many troops we had, actually 500,000 in Vietnam.
We did, yes.
We don't have, we have special forces in Ukraine, but we could pull this out in an hour. So, right. It's not the same thing. I think it's fair for people to worry that maybe, some of the things that Trump says, this deal allow us to keep giving them weapons and equipment and that kind of stuff. But, I think in the end, Nixon understood that like Ukraine, Vietnam was a problem that was preventing bigger and more important projects like the opening of China and detente with the Russians. And, he just had a harder problem to solve. And Trump seems to get that. He understands that Ukraine, it's a pissant place. No one should care about Ukraine. We need to get this tar baby away as quick as possible so we can do deals with the Russians. And I got a feeling that he imagines this. The other day, Putin was out saying, well, Trump signed this deal with the minerals for the Ukrainians. the territory we have has better minerals. We'd love to do a deal with Trump on exploiting these minerals in our area. I started laughing. I'm like, yeah, I got a feeling that everybody kind of knows what's really going to happen here. That, poor old Zelensky's going to end up, in a box somewhere or wherever. And, American companies and Russian companies are going to be digging the ground up in Ukraine so that, coal and graphite. Because, there's huge deposits of graphite. People forget that, one of the things that the Ukrainians did before the war, they were like the #1 producer of printed circuit boards. That was one of the things they did. It was a strange thing because they have there's something they have there that's actually some natural resource that's really useful in the production of printed circuit boards. And so they were, they were the main place for it. They also, I think, were the #1 supplier of neon, which, I think of neon, I think of neon signs,
Las Vegas or whatever. Yeah,
exactly. Open, or you did Joe's, apparently it's used in a lot of high tech stuff. So, but yeah, you can kind of see that coming, is that Trump and Putin are, they got the map out and they're drawing, well, you know what, I'll take this piece and you take that piece, poor old Zelensky, that I don't think he realizes what's coming his way.
Well, Zelensky is, I've noticed, how do I put this charitable? I won't try to put it charitable. He's a liar. He changes his mind by the hour. Yeah. And I think it exasperated even Rubio and JD Vance because they met with him privately. Zelensky was on board with a mineral deal. Then an hour later, he's bad-mouthing it to the press. It's just, and I think it left him flabbergasted. He's very unreliable man, just put it that way. But the parallels are interesting. Maybe the left and right, whatever that means, is flipped a little bit. I never thought I'd see the day that maybe the leftists are going to take to the streets in Europe demanding that we increase military involvement and increase nukes. It's bizarre. It's a bizarre world. Everything's flipped. But back in the day, the reason for South Vietnam is there's some parallels because I remember that what they called the domino theory. The idea was communism was expanding, and while South Vietnam was in a hugely strategic place, if it fell, then Thailand would fall, and then the whole Southeast would fall, then eventually Australia would fall. So we had to stop the dominoes from falling. That was the idea. And I know Nixon was a very big anti-communist. So I think that they were trying to square the circle of how to prop up. Really, it was a civil war in Vietnam, not so much a big, that's what it was down. And they had a corrupt leadership. How do you keep a corrupt leader in power? And the reason, well, we got to, because otherwise the communists will win and expand. And you're hearing the same rhetoric, but now this time from the left, that, well, if Putin is able to take parts of Ukraine, then, pretty soon tanks are going to be rolling in Paris. And it's just a weird jump. It's the argument of, you also often talk about it, morality. Whereas the current administration, they don't really talk in all these grandiose moral terms. They're talking in more sensible terms that nations have interest. Whereas it seems like Europe, a lot of the commentators, everything is 1938. And if you try to negotiate with someone, you're Chamberlain, you're doing appeasement. And even J.D. Vance, I don't know if you saw him writing about it, he got really frustrated with that idea. He's a young man, but we can't constantly live in the 1930s. But I would say we can't also live in the late 60s where if, Putin, he's not communist, number one, but if he takes Ukraine, it's going to start a new domino theory.
Yeah, we talked about this earlier about some of the sort of the weirdness of being old. It's kind of hard to adjust sometimes. And I just can imagine older me going back to meet younger me and say, look, in the future, the people you call the left are going to call the people on the right Hitler for demanding free speech.
Yeah.
Young me would say, well, yeah, you're lying. Yeah, and old me would say, oh no, we're just getting started. The left are going to be the warmongers. They're going to want to attack all these countries. Like, what? It's just completely crazy, But it kind of speaks to the fact that a lot of our politics, it really isn't what they present it as, and it kind of really ties back to Nixon. The start of this sort of game they've been playing on us, the fake right versus a fake left, really started back then. Nixon was a guy who was genuinely an anti-communist, And the people, in Washington, they were starting to think past, past America defending the free world, past America as the defenders of liberty and all this. And of course, after the Cold War ended, they were free to go crazy. And they, look, the last 30 years of our politics has been entirely fake. We know this now. We have the receipts, billions, tens of it. Probably, I did the math. Maybe I said this last time. I did the math. About $100 billion a year came pouring into our politics, all to people who had the same point of view. You add up the private donors, government agencies that has been reported, and USAID. I mean, that's an enormous amount of money. I mean, Kamala Harris, they spent $1 billion trying to tell us that DMV lady was the super popular woman. And,
Right.
of course, turn off it. And it just, when you think about it, it's like, well, it's all been fake all along. And it really does have its roots in Nixon, because, that was their win. They won. And after that, because, Reagan, he was afraid of being tarred as Nixon. I mean, even Bill Clinton was afraid of the impeachment stuff, of being driven away. Our presidents have all been pussies since Nixon. Reagan was he talked a tough game, but he really wasn't. And the first Bush, I mean, the guy was the head of the CIA, and I mean, he was kind of a wimp. And Clinton, obviously, or Barack Obama, excuse me. I mean, Trump is really the first genuine tough guy. I mean, we know this. I mean, the man got shot. I mean, and his instinct was to. I mean, I swear to this day, if the Secret Service hadn't stopped him, he would have turned around to where the bullet came from and gave the guy the finger. I mean,
Yeah.
it
was amazing, and you can't script that. This wasn't a PR stunt. This is something that just happens that's based on your character. And Trump is a courageous man. And actually, Nixon was too. He had that quality, different, but he was a courageous man.
Yeah, what Trump has over Nixon is that the hindsight, the benefit of hindsight. I think somewhere along the line, somebody got to Trump in his wilderness years, the last 4 years, and explained to him what was really going on, because these guys are moving too fast and too smart to be an accident. Somebody, there's a deep throat somewhere that's explaining to them how all this stuff works inside the blob, and that, and because it's, I mean, somebody had to tell them. I mean, look, I studied this stuff a lot in my life, and I didn't know all this stuff was. I'm shocked at some of this stuff.
Oh, I am too. I knew there was corruption, but I was just shocked to the level. It just astounded me. And I think, and I'm just looking in his eyes, I could be projecting, but I think Elon Musk, and I know a lot of people have issues with him. They think he has ulterior motives. I don't know what that would be. He's already the richest man in the world, right? He's not going to steal your social security number to get your money. I mean, let's be honest here. He's got access to your social security. Yeah.
Elon said he's a Nigerian prince.
Yeah, exactly. You have to send him money. I think he looks pretty flabbergasted based on the financial system of the United States. And I'm getting the feel that things are worse than we quite understand. Like Elon Musk said something interesting today. He said, now we are in the federal budget spending more on paying our debt interest on it than we are entire national defense. It's finally exceeded that. And it's going the wrong way. Eventually things are going to break, because if you can't pay the interest on your debt, you got real problems. And I know I'm going to get a lot of people out there, well, just screw the debt, not pay it. Well, okay, then we're not going to be able to borrow money. Then what are we going to do? Super raise taxes? That will crash the economy. We do drastic cuts that could cause civil unrest with certain demographics. Print it, then you have hyperinflation. I have a sense that we're going through a real transitional period economically. And getting back to how this ties to Nixon, and I don't have this on the prep, so correct me if I get it wrong. Wasn't Nixon the one that kind of got us off the gold standard onto the petrodollar? And I was going
the same way. Yeah.
Yeah. It was like, so that was a fundamental transformation of the economy that happened under Nixon, that we could be, like you said, at the bookend. We're going through another transformation now, that the whole petrodollar thing could be coming to the end. But I remember that was Kissinger was negotiating with Saudi Arabia and all of them. And Basically, we
Yeah.
said, hey, we'll let you, go to Las Vegas, have all the hookers you want, and protect you, but you're going to sell oil in dollars. And so,
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up because it's exactly right. Back when there was a peg, I think it was like $32 per ounce for gold.
mhm,
And of course, the market price for gold was different. And the French were actually trying to make a run on the American gold supply. And that's what led Nixon to finally close the gold window. They tried all these different things, but they realized that this system that had been set up that was really generous to the Europeans by having dollar pegged to the gold. And
mhm,
it was kind of screwing us a little bit, but it helped out rebuild France, rebuild Germany. Of course, the
mhm,
French being French, as soon as they got back on their feet, they said, "Hey, how can we try and steal from our
mhm.
patron?" And so they tried to do this run on the gold supply. And it really, Nixon people got mad at him for going off to the gold standard, but he really didn't have a choice because all of a sudden he was faced with this economic reality, this difficulty. And, look, he floundered around. He was stuck. He called himself a Keynesian. He was kind of stuck with what he had to work with. But eventually, we wound up starting to see things like deregulation, which started at the end of Nixon's time, and then it really accelerated under Carter. You had the beginnings of the new currency arrangements, and I think the petrodollar was signed in '74, so that was Nixon. I think it was '74.
Yeah, that was his last year. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So, I think it's very similar. And I think, I said this the last time we talked. I think what Trump is looking around saying, you know what, we got to be a different country now. We're good at being the bank, and we're going to be the bank. That's what we're going to do. And we're going to be the investors. We're going to look at this just in a pure money sense. And hey, if you want to, if Saudi Arabia wants to be a kingdom or Iran wants to be a theocracy, if we can do business with them, we'll do business with them. If you're bad for business, you're bad for, we're going to run like the mafia in a way. Remember that scene? If you remember, was it the first Godfather where the guy, they were talking about selling drugs, and the Godfather goes, look, it's not our business. And as long as your business doesn't interfere with our business, it's none of our business. I think that's going to be the new way of looking at things, And I'm struggling to understand a problem with this, really.
Yeah, it's so funny because I brought up last week, but I was watching all those Godfather movies, like when Michael Corleone went to talk to, they meant for it to be Bugsy Siegel, but who was it? Mo Green, I think it was.
Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah.
He goes, I think I'm going to buy out your casinos. My credit good enough to buy out your casino? He goes, what are you talking about? I buy you out. I made my bones when you were just dating cheerleaders. But the point was, he said, well, you seem to be unlucky. You're not making money because the Corleone family invested in the casino, and this guy, Mo Green, was skimming from the casino. And that was his way of saying, the gig is up. And I thought of that with kind of Trump and Zelensky when the Americans asked, what happened to our money exactly? And it just created a big uproar. And Zelensky, I don't understand the man. He doesn't seem very smart. He just like, I don't know. I didn't get half of it. I don't know where it went. And that's not a good answer to give to someone who cares about money, You give someone 140 billion, or let's say 200 billion, and they're like, I don't know where 100 billion went. Is that an issue? I was like, yeah, that's an issue. And,
when he said I had no idea where the money, I was like, oh my Lord. That's like the worst thing. There's no worse answer when the guy who gave you money is asking for where the money is, and you say, I have no idea. You're saying, hey, kill me. That's really what you're saying.
Yeah, it is. In the business world, you said you used to go in and look at books and stuff. Could you imagine like half the money gone? Yes, where it went? Like, I don't know. Who knows? Search me. That's not a good answer.
In my business career once, when I was a younger guy, I was a field controller, and part of it was collections.
Yeah.
And one of the things, this was business to business collections, but one of the things you learn a lot about the human condition when you have to start collecting money. And you can understand why the mafia does the things that they do. It just all starts to make sense to you. And every time I see Zelensky, I think of this one guy that I had to collect money from. And he had this trick he would do. He would agree and then ask for something. And someone eventually put me in on it. He goes, it's called the nibble. What he's doing is he's going to agree to the original deal plus a little bit more. He's really, for him, you're in a negotiation. And so I can't keep doing this. This is nuts. So basically, this was heavy equipment. we just showed up on a Saturday morning at like 5 o'clock in the morning and repossessed the equipment. And then Monday morning, it was an entirely different negotiation. It was kind of like me putting his head in the toilet, saying, flushing it, saying, where's my money, But
Right.
that's how you have to do these guys. They're just this kind of person that there's something wrong with them. They just can't be square. They've always got to have an angle to it. And that's Zelensky. Well, you know what it
big
is?
time.
He's a drug addict too. He's a coke.
Yeah.
There's no question in my mind. I've been around a lot of people who take drugs. I'm not talking recreationally, who have a problem.
Yeah.
He ticks all the boxes.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. And well, you wrote about Nixon, getting back to Nixon. Didn't he have the same problem in America? Because they were frustrated with the South Vietnamese government. They had issues with some of the leaders there.
Yeah, it's funny. Like the Kennedy brothers had the guy's name was like Ngo Diem, his weird Vietnamese names. And it's a great story because it just kind of tells you how stupid we are sometimes as Americans. They told the Vietnamese, yeah, he's got to go. So they killed him. They're like, no, we didn't say kill him. It's like, well, that's what
he's
we
gone.
heard. Yeah. He's gone anyway, right? But yeah, the problem with it goes back to George Washington, though. You go back and you read his farewell address, and man, I read it. I don't know, a couple of months ago. I read it. I remember sitting there thinking, man, first of all, this guy was smart. I mean, just smarter than anybody today. But the other thing is that all the things we need to know about foreign policy are right there. These are basic rules of life. Because, it goes back. He was making subtle references to Thucydides and the Greeks. This was a brilliant man, and he was considered one of the dumber founding fathers, which is really kind of amazing in a way. But,
he wasn't supposedly a great speaker, although he's an intelligent man, but he wasn't an orator. He wasn't like a Thomas Jefferson or something like that.
Yeah, or a great writer. He didn't have a great way with words or stuff,
Right.
But, but he makes the basic point, that you can't, the basic point of countries can't have friends. Countries have interests. Because as soon as you have friends, Israel's enemies became our enemies. Israel is the greatest example of this, And look, Nixon, that's one of the weird things about Nixon and Israel. He understood that. He worried about becoming too involved with Israel would alienate the rest of the Arab world.
Right.
And I always wonder if that wasn't part of it. Because, look, Johnson's number one advisor, who actually lived at the White House with him, was an arch-Zionist who owned, I think, United Artists Cinemas. His wife, that guy's wife, was she was a convert. She was Swedish. She went to Israel, converted to Judaism so that she could be a part of the underground killing British soldiers in the Levant. So these two were complete Israel fanatics. And they lived in the damn White House and basically set Israel policy. And Nixon was a big departure from that. So I couldn't rule out that, I always suspected they had something to do with the Kennedy brothers, who were not real big fans of Israel. And we know their father was definitely not a big fan of Israel. Big fan of Walt Disney, but not a fan of Israel. And, that the Israelis didn't have some role in getting Nixon overthrown.
That could be. I know Nixon did support them in the Yom Kippur War. But part of it was also just because during the Cold War, there was a lot of, you didn't want Soviet influence in some of these countries. So we had to play that game too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, that was part of it. Let's take the questions and we'll wrap up. And we already got quite a few, so this is great. And it's very generous ones. We got a rant for $20. Danny Vegas. Admire all your work. All the best to you both. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And let's see here. I got some more over here. I'm going to go through and let's see here. Dan Davis, $20, another $20 one. So excellent. Ukraine's minerals are mostly in the east. A deal had to be made over them so the proceeds can be used to rebuild the country. Trump's trying to cheat Zelensky and company out of their cut. I wrote about this today, and I don't know if you're going to write about this or talk about this, Z-Man. It's probably a complex subject. I don't understand this mineral deal because my understanding, most of the minerals are under Russian soil. And so what is this deal anyway with Zelensky? Is it a way to show Zelensky that they're in our debt? or because I don't think we're going to get a dime for him. Maybe I'm cynical. I just don't see Zelensky, as soon as he can, even if he made money on this, he's going to renege on the deal. That's because that's how he rolls.
Yeah, you know what I think it is? Because Trump kept saying minerals plus today or yesterday. And I'm like, okay, what's the plus? And so I actually saw on some Ukrainian channels what was supposed to be the text of it. And basically, we're going to have control of the port of Odessa, and we're going to control the pipelines and control the oil and gas resources of Ukraine. So it's minerals. The minerals are small potatoes. I mean, there is huge graphite deposits, which are very important in the western part of Ukraine, but it's the oil and gas. I mean, that's what it gets down. You know, in a weird way, Trump, he seems to be obsessed with oil and gas, which makes sense because it's the most important resource on the planet. And I think this is what this is all about, is that, you know, he looks at Europe and says, you know, we can keep these guys under control. We have this huge supplies of LNG that they're dependent on. But hey, if we can control the pipelines coming through Ukraine and maybe the parts of Turk Stream that run through Ukraine, well, now we got more control over Europe. We can squeeze these guys as much as we want. I really think, I think Trump is just looking at this like he's squeezing another business. That's all it is. It's just a pure money deal for him.
Yeah, and he doesn't matter. He'll humiliate Zelensky to his face, call him a little dictator. The guy's a little midget. And Zelensky just has to take it, and Trump doesn't care. I think Trump wants to mostly normalize relations with Russia, not because he's a Kremlin spy, but because he thinks that would lower energy prices, which would then theoretically lower the prices in the stores and everything. I think he would see it good for our economy. I think that's his number one goal, really. And Ukraine is just getting in the way of normalizing relations.
Well, you know, Putin made an interesting speech about a month ago where he said, look, the United States and Russia are very similar in that both countries have a tremendous amount of energy resources and export these to the rest of the world. But we're also two countries that have high energy demands. So it's very important for both of us to have control of the energy markets. And I think that's really what this is about, is that, you know, look, it's not a bad plan. You know, if Russia and the United States control the bulk of the energy markets, well, then the rest of the world has to fall in line.
Yeah. And as I said earlier, and you brought this up, Trump thinks from a very business point of view, not so much from all the morality. I mean, to a degree he does. I think he's genuine. I do think he thinks from a humanitarian point of view. It's horrible, all this death happening in Ukraine. But mostly he's about dollars and cents, what makes sense for America. And that's what's driving it. And I think that's a departure from the Europeans that make everything into 1938. And so, Robert, thank you. $3. If Nixon had beat Kennedy in 1960, and some say he did, would have he blocked the course of the 1965 immigration and other civil rights laws passed, or was that based in the cake? What would have Nixon have done? Robert, interesting question. I like these what if questions. I don't think so, because Nixon really enforced the desegregation in the South. And he wasn't this, he was aware, I'm sure, of racial matters, just like most of the men of his era were. This is common knowledge. I think it probably would have still gone through. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, because, I think in a lot of ways, the reason that the usual suspects got the loosening of immigration is because, you know, the people who were, guys like Nixon, well, they were civic nationalists. They said, oh, well, you know, immigration's been good, you know. What how bad can it be? You know, we're gonna allow some of these other people in. And I don't know. I don't think Nixon, I think, it's probably, if Nixon had won, we probably wouldn't have had Vietnam. That's probably, there have been other things, other bigger stuff. And if you take Vietnam out of the picture, the country's history in the 20th century is wildly different. So, but I think as far as immigration, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Part of it, you remember Nixon was from California, and he grew up in at least his experience was probably 95% all white country. That's what he knew. He didn't know the South. And a lot of people back then, even conservatives, I'm using the expression they would use, is that they had they felt bad for the Negro in the South and how they were treated, and we need to do better for them. And they really believed that. And probably with his Quaker upbringing, he thought that too. I know Reagan kind of was that way too. So while on some ways they were kind of race realists and they understood the score to a degree, they never lived around it, and they really kind of felt sorry for all this stuff. So I think, I don't think Nixon would have been any different in that way.
Yeah, I mean, these old guys, my business partner's in his 70s, and he says, look, I never met a black guy till college. His roommate was one of the football players. Black people were just occasionally on television. That's it. That's all he ever knew. I mean, he'd never actually seen a real living black. I mean, it was just crazy how different the world was compared to today. And I think, it's understandable. I mean, you can't know what you don't know, and I think that was true of that generation.
Well, Sasha's father, my wife's father, he's passed on, but he was an old timer. And in Northwest Arkansas, there was 0 blacks when he was raised. I mean, literally none here. And so he was like pretty sympathetic to the plight of them, the civil rights, Sasha said. But then he moved to the Chicago area and he got a different view of everything quickly. So it does. I think Nixon, though, I don't think he would have, because again, he was for trying to, the civil rights laws and all that. I think Nixon was on board with. Again, Nixon wasn't what people portrayed him to be as this hard radical right winger. He just really wasn't. Tony, this is a good question. Nixon famously resigned over Watergate in 1974. Is there any way you feel that Trump could be made to resign? And if so, would you not mind J.D. Vance being in the role of president? Would Vance be up to the task? Okay, I'll answer this and I'll have Z-Man answer. There's 2 parts. Do I think Trump would be made to resign? I don't think Trump has that in his personality to resign ever. Oh, can you hear me or? Hello, Z-Man?
Oh, there we go. We're back.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Sorry about that. My audio cut out.
No, that's fine. Did you hear the question? I'll read it to you again.
Yeah,
you hear the okay. Let me just repeat the question. Nixon famously resigned over Watergate in 1974. Is there any way you feel that Trump could be made to resign? And if so, would you support J.D. Vance being in the role of president? And would J.D. Vance be up to the task? And I'll answer it first, and I'll pass it to Z-Man. I don't think there's any way in hell that Trump would ever resign. He's not like Nixon that way. But yeah, I do think J.D. Vance would be a good president. So how would you answer that? Do you think Trump would resign?
I mean, I just can't imagine any scenario that would happen. I mean, look, he beat the best. He took their best shots, literally and figuratively, and they're terrified of him. And look, there's a person I know that works in Blob, and he keeps saying that everyone is just terrified. It's like their worst nightmare is not because of what he's doing, the things that they predicted. It's that he seems to know what they're going to do before they know it, they do it. And, so I just can't imagine a scenario. But as far as Vance goes, I like Vance. I mean, I understand, he's married to an Indian woman and all that stuff, but, nobody's perfect, I mean, and I'm very old fashioned in that I can accept a man who marries an Indian woman or a Chinese woman or whatever, but not the other way around. If a white woman marries an Indian dude, well, you get married off to his clan, and that's who you belong to now. So,
yeah, I've never been a purist in that either. I think we got to deal with what we have. And J.D. Vance, he's extremely intelligent, articulate. I've been very impressed, and some of his talking points just sound like from our sphere exactly. I'm really just like, wow.
It's a little spooky sometimes. Some of the things he said. I mean, people didn't notice. He used the word "red pill" in a press in an interview.
Yeah, well,
I mean, that's one of those clues. You're like, wait a second, this guy knows.
Yeah, and I wouldn't doubt there's. I know for sure. Elon Musk has read 4chan, politically incorrect. I know he does, and I wouldn't doubt a lot of these people secretly see a lot of on our side. They see a lot of the material. They can't admit to it, but. They do use a lot of the terminology now. So that's kind of a white pill, if I could use that expression, that we do make a difference. People can make a difference, and you guys all out there can make a difference. Joseph, and then we'll be wrapping up here soon, just a little over, but good questions. Thank you for your support. Nixon will forever be disliked by the woke in their view on the war on drugs. Oh, that's right. He officially started the war on drugs.
Right.
Dislike for libertarians for getting us off the gold standard. In Ramsey Z-Man's view, it's unfair to blame Nixon for either. Well, the war on drugs, boy, it was like the hippie era, and he saw the drugs being a problem, and in many ways, I think he was right. I know this is a big debate in our circles about I'm not the libertarian position that all drugs should be illegal, because then you get places like Seattle, and I don't want to pick up dead bodies on the street. The gold standard, I think he was kind of forced off that. We kind of talked about it. And so what do you think? Do you blame Nixon for the war on drugs? Or do you think you understand why he did it?
Yeah, I mean, I think his intentions were good. I mean, I think, we should discourage behavior that is harmful to individuals and harmful to us as a society. And being, drunk all the time or high or anything else,
Yeah.
I mean, these are not things we encourage. And we certainly don't want to, encourage children to do these things. I mean, I think that's just completely irrational. But I did a show a couple of weeks ago on drug war, and it's really astonishing, the kind of shenanigans that have gone on. I mean, we could do a lot much better on the drug issue, and the problem is that there's a lot of money to be made selling people self-destruction. It's just the way it is.
Oh, it is. It is, and it's like all women now are on some type of drug that's prescribed, it seems like. So it's,
hey, look, every time I go to the damn doctor, I don't tell her anything, because, I mean, as soon, I got a hangnail, we have a drug for that. I mean, they're just drug pushers. I mean, I have known drug dealers in my life who are not as aggressive as my doctor.
Well, did you see that, Elon Musk, he put out that email they had to do. What did you do? 5 things you did last week. And that got them all upset. And this one woman says she was traumatized about it. And someone wrote him back, said that she had to go into therapy and get on Xanax because of that email. And I'm like, my God. I mean, really?
Hey, it gets back to that guy at the, we talked about this last week, the guy at the Munich conference starts crying.
Oh, that cried, yes.
I was like, oh, my Lord. Yeah. What it actually gets back to? You remember the scene from Braveheart where Longshanks comes in and he throws the guy out the window?
Yeah.
We need a lot of people thrown out of windows. I mean, that's not sad to say, but that's really where we are right now.
Yeah, that was a great scene. Definitely Mel Gibson is a scene they couldn't make anymore, but it was really key. So Z-Man, it's been a real fun show, and thank you guys all your support. We're getting good support, and I appreciate you guys all being here. We got almost 1,100 people watching now, so thank you. And before you go, we'll be back next week, and we'll think of a new topic. This has been so much fun. How can people always let them, if they want to? I highly recommend every day. The first thing I do, well, I do other things first. I get up early, but then I always check your blog to see what you're writing about. And I usually read it over breakfast. And so you got your blog and you got your podcast you do every Friday, right?
Yep. ZMAN.com, THEZMAN. And the easiest way to find it, you put it in the search engine. I'm the first guy it pops up. And, all this stuff is there. And I write something every day, do a Friday podcast. You can also get behind the green door, which will get you almost 4 pieces of content a week now I'm doing. Excellent. It's, I mean, and you know what? And people need to start thinking about how they can send us money during the show. I mean, it's a nice start, but we need more money, because enthusiasm does not go to the bank. When I go to the bank and I'm enthusiastic, they say, I'm sorry, we only take money. So,
we got another one. Morgoth gave $2. Thank you. So I dismissed that. But we got a lot more this week than last week. It's going to be growing, and I really do appreciate it. And as a disclaimer, I can't speak for Z-Man, but Z-Man, I somehow missed out on all this USAID funds. I never got a penny. I don't know if you've been funded by some NGO, but I have not.
I got no Russian money and I got no USAID money. I don't know what the hell I'm doing wrong.
I know. I'm like, Laura Chin got $10 million. I'm like, what's wrong with me, man? Come on, send me money. I'll fill out the damn form so I could do it. But no Russian money or no Soros money, no USAID money for me.
Yeah, the goal of this show is that by the end of the year, we're doing the Scrooge McDuck at the end, diving into the gold coin, swimming around.
Yeah, and Elon Musk, if you're watching the show, I will sell out to whatever you do. We'll just I'll be a Doge fanboy if you give us like $10 million. Wow, that's for sure. So
I
I
mean,
can be, I can be, I can be bought.
I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, I'll take $1 million. I mean, look, I'm so easy. $500,000. I will be a sellout for $500,000.
I know. So, yeah, we guys really do appreciate your support. And again, I love doing the show with Z-Man. We think alike. We're kind of in the same sphere without all the, craziness. And you've written about it. That was my favorite post of you. No, we're not changing our name to a Roman Empire. We're not sacrificing goats. We're not doing imperial decrees. I'm not saying who, but this actually happened.
Yeah. I got to tell you that the day I started saying that, I'm thinking, man, this is why they invented the internet. This guy is just as crazy as it comes. Lord. But then Kanye West showed up years later. I mean, it's like, it just, every time you think that they've got they've gone as far as they can go, they find a new gear.
And it's so funny how people have attacked me because I said, yeah, I don't know if a guy that wears a Git mask that's praising Mustache Man is really presidential material. Oh, you're just a cock, Ramsey Paul. I'm like, yeah, I've heard it. You're just weak on that one question. I'm like, oh, good grief. It's just like, come on.
You know what I want? We're talking about money. I want a nickel for every time someone turns up in my social media feeds telling me that someone's Jewish. I know. That would be. I would have so many nickels.
I get so tired of it because one of my favorite guys in the Trump administration is Jewish, Stephen Miller. And it's just like, I get so tired of it. And it's so funny because these people say, oh, you're really soft about that topic. I'm like, really? The stuff I talked about, the Israeli influence over our politicians. I'm always after Tom Cotton. He's our senator from Arkansas. And I always joke with him. I said, hey, if you ever come back here, I'll show you around. You probably don't remember the place. That's another show we could do, how our politicians are totally sold out. They don't even care about their states. So, but yeah. Oh, you're just weak on that question. I'm like, oh, good grief. Come on, guys.
To that crowd, you can never be strong enough.
They just want, I think they would want every show just to say that 3-letter word over and over and over for 90 minutes. It's like, come on, guys. ETNM, he gave a super chat, enthusiasm fee. Thank you.
All right, there we go.
That makes us thank you. And we'll see you next week. We'll figure out what topic to do, but it's been a lot of fun, and we'll let Z-Man get ready to go to bed so he can write a great column in the morning. And I got to post my show for tomorrow day too. So we'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.